Democracy has never been killed by people who wanted to destroy it. It has been killed every single time by people who believed they were saving it. Sit with that for a moment. Let it settle into the part of your brain that wants to reject it. In December 2024, a Marist poll found that 73% of Americans believed there was a serious threat to the future of the nation's democracy. 73%. Nearly 3 out of 4 citizens, surveyed in what remains the most powerful republic on Earth, concluded that the system was crumbling beneath their feet. But here is the datum that should keep you awake. 16 months earlier, that number was 87%. The alarm dropped 14 points while the conditions that produced it did not improve. The threat, by every measurable indicator, intensified. The fear diminished. This is not how genuine existential crises behave. When a building is on fire, the panic does not decrease as the flames spread. So the central question becomes unavoidable. What if the feeling of democratic collapse is not a symptom of democracy dying, but the mechanism through which it contracts? The 2024 NBC News exit poll recorded a striking inversion. 34% of voters said democracy mattered most to their vote, surpassing the economy at 31%, a result that had no precedent in recent exit poll data. A slim majority, 53%, rated the health of democracy as a critical issue, according to the Pre-American Values Survey. Democrats, Republicans, Independents, all 3 groups reported alarm. The numbers varied. Democrats at 86%. Independents at 74%, Republicans at 61%, the concern was functionally universal. And yet, Gallup's September 2024 data revealed something far more disquieting than the alarm itself. There was zero overlap between Republican and Democratic voters in the top 5 issues they ranked as extremely important. Not partial overlap, not minimal overlap. Known. These 2 populations did not disagree on the severity of the crisis. They disagreed on what the crisis was. They disagreed on what democracy meant, what threatened it, and who was dismantling it. This is not a debate. A debate requires a shared frame of reference. What the data describes is 2 populations inhabiting incompatible realities, each convinced the other is holding the detonator. The alarm is symmetrical. The diagnosis is mutually exclusive. If every generation produces a cohort convinced it is witnessing democracy's final hour, Weimar, Germany, France, 1958, the United States in 1968, 1974, 2001, 2008, and now 2024, then either every generation has been wrong, or the alarm itself performs a function entirely separate from accuracy. The sincerity is never in question. The pattern, however, demands an explanation that sincerity alone cannot provide. If you are watching this and already forming your counter-argument, good. Tell me in the comments what you think the pattern means. Because the history suggests an answer most people would rather not hear. In 1919, the architects of the Weimar Republic drafted what was hailed as the most democratic constitution Europe had ever produced. Universal suffrage, proportional representation, robust civil liberties codified into foundational law. It was not a tentative experiment conducted by uncertain reformers. It was the gold standard, built by people who had studied every democratic failure that preceded them and believed, with the fervent confidence of engineers, that they had designed a system immune to authoritarian capture. 15 years later, that system legally voted itself into dictatorship. The Constitution was not abolished. It was used. The people who enabled the transition were not, in the main, authoritarians. They were Democrats, liberals, centrists, conservatives, terrified that democracy was under existential threat from the other side. The mechanism was not a coup. It was consensus, assembled from alarm, ratified by voters who believed they were choosing the lesser catastrophe. Every democracy that has collapsed in the past century has collapsed while its citizens were convinced they were defending it. The alarm was real. The threat was real. The response was the trap. By the time the Weimar Reichstag passed the Enabling Act on March 23, 1933, transferring legislative authority to the executive, the members who voted yes did not believe they were ending democracy. They believed they were preserving order long enough for democracy to resume. The emergency, they told themselves, was temporary. Article 48, the constitutional clause that permitted the president to suspend civil liberties in times of crisis, was not a Nazi invention. Liberal Democrats wrote it in 1919 as a safeguard, a circuit breaker for the moments when the system needed protecting from its enemies. It was invoked over 100 times before Hitler ever held office, under Ebert, under Hindenburg, by chancellors who considered themselves guardians of the Republic. Most of those invocations were justified as necessary to protect democracy. The question is not whether democracy is under threat. The question is whether the people sounding the alarm are the ones holding the knife, and whether they would recognize their own hands if they looked down. In 1919, Germany built the most democratic government Europe had ever seen. 15 years later, that government had legally dismantled itself. The people who wrote the Constitution and the people who destroyed it were, in many cases, the same individuals. This is not a metaphor. It is a sequence of legislative votes, each one rational, each one justified, each one bringing the Republic one step closer to its own abolition. The mechanism deserves examination, not because Weimar is unique, but because it is archetypal. The Weimar Constitution, ratified on August 11, 1919, established universal suffrage for all citizens over 20, men and women alike, a radical provision for its era. Proportional representation ensured that even minor parties received seats commensurate with their vote share. Civil liberties were codified with a specificity that constitutional scholars across the continent studied with undisguised envy. Separation of powers, an independent judiciary, protections for religious and ethnic minorities. The architects had examined every failure of the Kaiserreich and designed, with considerable precision, a system meant to prevent its recurrence. They succeeded. The system was not flawed. What the architects had not anticipated was that a constitution designed to resist the concentrated power of a monarch would prove vulnerable to something far more diffuse, the distributed panic of a frightened electorate. The external threat, a return to autocracy, had been accounted for. The internal threat had not. That democratic citizens themselves would become the vector of collapse. This omission was not stupidity. It was a failure of imagination so common it barely qualifies as failure at all. Every constitutional designer in history has made the same miscalculation. They fortify against the last catastrophe and leave the next one unguarded. Between 1919 and 1929, the Republic functioned. Imperfectly, contentiously, with street violence and political assassinations punctuating the intervals between elections. But it functioned. The Reichstag passed legislation. Coalitions formed and dissolved and reformed. Article 48, that now infamous emergency provision permitting the president to suspend civil liberties by decree, was invoked occasionally, always temporarily, always with the understanding that normalcy would resume. By contrast, between 1930 and 1933, Article 48 became the primary instrument of governance. The Reichstag, the democratic parliament elected by democratic voters, passed fewer laws than the president issued by executive decree. Chancellor Brüning governed almost entirely through emergency powers, bypassing the legislature not because parliament had ceased to exist, but because parliament could no longer agree on anything. Democracy did not collapse. It was suspended, session by session, decree by decree, by Democrats who believed suspension was the only alternative to chaos. The Nazi Party never won a majority in a free election. This fact is worth repeating, because it disrupts the narrative most people carry that Germany chose fascism. Germany did not choose fascism. Germany failed to choose anything else. In the July 1932 election, the high water mark of Nazi electoral performance, Hitler's party received 37% of the vote. Substantial, certainly, alarming, undeniably, but 63% of the electorate voted for other parties. Parties that collectively possessed the numerical power to form a coalition government and govern without Nazi participation. They did not. The reason was not apathy. The reason was alarm. The Social Democrats, the largest Democratic Party, believed the Communists represented the existential threat to the Republic. The Communists, following directives from Moscow, believed the Social Democrats were social fascists, a greater danger than the actual fascists. The Center Party, Catholic and moderate, believed both left-wing factions were dismantling the social order. The conservative nationalists believed parliamentary democracy itself was the disease. Each faction diagnosed a different pathology. Each prescribed a different cure. What united them, the single thread connecting every party in the Reichstag, was the absolute conviction that democracy was under mortal threat from the other side of the aisle. This conviction was not irrational. The communists were attempting revolution. The Nazis were attempting insurrection. The economy had disintegrated. The conviction was earned through evidence, which made it all the more lethal. Earned conviction does not negotiate. It entrenche. The result was parliamentary paralysis, which justified further invocation of Article 48, which normalized governance by decree, which made the eventual transition to dictatorship feel less like a rupture and more like an incremental extension of the emergency measures already in place. The ratchet turned. It only turned one direction. On March 23, 1933, the Reichstag voted on the Enabling Act, legislation that transferred full legislative authority from Parliament to the Chancellor's office. It required a two-thirds supermajority. It received 83%. The Social Democrats voted against it alone. The Communists had already been banned. The Center Party voted yes, having received private assurances that the Catholic Church would be protected. The Conservatives voted yes, confident they could control Hitler once the immediate crisis passed. Every faction acted to save democracy from the faction it feared most. The consequence: the legal, constitutional, democratically ratified end of democracy surprised no one who had been paying attention. And almost no one had been. Weimar did not fall because Germans stopped caring about democracy. It fell because they cared so much they were willing to suspend it. And once suspended, the pattern is not coincidence. It is design, not conspiracy, design. The feeling of democratic crisis is the most reliable tool for contracting democratic systems, and it works precisely because the people who feel it are sincere. Once suspended, the question was never whether it would happen again. The question: democracies are structurally anxious systems. They distribute power, which generates competition. They protect dissent, which guarantees conflict. They demand compromise, leaving every faction partially defeated at all times. The result: a form of government that always feels precarious. Because it is. This is not a defect. It is the architecture. The alarm, then, is not manufactured from nothing. It amplifies a structural truth, the way a microphone does not create sound but makes existing vibrations unbearable. Every democracy sits one election, one crisis, one emergency clause away from contraction. The distance between self-governance and its suspension has never been more than a single legislative session. What matters is not the proximity of the threat. What matters is what populations do when they believe the threat is imminent. And what they do, with remarkable consistency across centuries and continents, is grant permission. Consider the data. In the 2024 US election, 34% of voters ranked democracy as their most important issue, surpassing the economy for the first time in modern American polling. By September 2025, political extremism and threats to democracy had risen to the single most cited concern among Americans, according to the Reuters Ipsos Core Political Survey. The alarm was not peripheral, it was dominant. But here is the detail that should give any observer vertigo. There was zero overlap between Republican and Democratic voters on the top 5 issues they considered extremely important. None. Not a single shared priority. Both populations believed democracy was under siege. Neither population agreed on what democracy meant, who threatened it, or what saving it required. The alarm was symmetrical, the mobilization was symmetrical, the contraction, the willingness to concentrate power in preferred institutions, to justify exception, to treat the opposing faction as an existential rather than political adversary, was symmetrical. This is not dysfunction. This is the mechanism functioning exactly as designed. Alarm bypasses deliberation. This is its utility. A population engaged in careful cost-benefit analysis does not grant emergency powers. A population convinced the building is burning does. The word emergency performs a specific grammatical function in democratic politics. It transforms the impermissible into the necessary. On October 26, 2001, the USA Patriot Act passed the United States Senate by a vote of 98-1. Warrantless surveillance, indefinite detention without trial, expanded executive authority over immigration, finance, and communications. The emergency was real. 3,000 people had died 6 weeks earlier. The response was framed as temporary. 23 years later, the core provisions remain operative. The emergency ended. The powers did not. This is not an anomaly. It is the norm. Institutions do not relinquish authority voluntarily, for the same reason a fire department does not advocate for fewer fires. The incentive structure is not hidden, it is definitional. An intelligence apparatus that admits the threat has diminished is an intelligence apparatus arguing for its own budget reduction. No organism behaves this way. No institution does either. What followed the Patriot Act was not a restoration of the status quo ante. It was a permanent expansion of executive surveillance capacity, normalized through repetition, renewed through bipartisan consensus, and rendered invisible by the very alarm that had justified it. The population moved on, the architecture remained. Carl Schmitt wrote it in 1922. 3 words that would outlast every constitution he helped dismantle. Sovereign is he who decides on the exception. The sentence is not philosophy, it is an operating manual. Whoever defines the emergency defines the boundaries of permissible power. The citizens living inside that emergency will not only accept the redefinition, they will demand it. The central question posed at the beginning was not whether democracy faces genuine threats. The answer to that has always been yes. The question was whether the recurring feeling of democratic collapse is a symptom of democracy dying or the mechanism through which it contracts. 3 centuries, 3 continents, 3 distinct political systems, the evidence points to the same conclusion. The feeling of democratic crisis is both genuine and instrumental. These 2 properties do not cancel each other, they compound. Every case examined follows an identical sequence. A real threat emerges. Alarm mobilizes the population. The mobilized population grants exceptional powers to counter the threat, and those powers outlast the crisis that justified them. Weimar's Article 48 was invoked to protect the Republic. It became the instrument of its dissolution. The Patriot Act surveillance architecture persists 2 decades later, renewed through bipartisan consensus. France's Fourth Republic was suspended to resolve the Algerian crisis. De Gaulle's concentrated executive power became the permanent structure of the Fifth. In each instance, the contraction was authorized by citizens who believed, correctly, that democracy was endangered. Their accuracy did not inoculate them against the trap, it delivered them into it. The alarm is real, the alarm is also the weapon. These facts coexist without contradiction, and the coexistence is the entire point. This recurrence is not a failure of vigilance or education. It is human cognition under conditions of perceived existential threat interacting with systems designed to distribute power. That distribution generates perpetual competition. Competition produces genuine friction. Friction produces genuine alarm. Alarm produces demand for resolution. Resolution, in political systems, means consolidation. Fewer decision makers, faster action, suspended deliberation. The cycle is self-catalyzing. What makes this mechanism so durable is its immunity to self-awareness. Knowing the pattern exists does not neutralize it. The Weimar Social Democrats understood the risks of Article 48. They had debated them in committee, published warnings in party newspapers, delivered speeches on the Reichstag floor. When the moment arrived, 83% of the remaining parliament voted to transfer legislative power to the executive anyway. The Center Party members who cast those votes were not ignorant of history. They were participants in it, acting under conditions that made the alternative, inaction in the face of perceived catastrophe, feel unconscionable. The trap does not catch the uninformed, it catches the informed who believe their situation is the exception. This is the significance that extends beyond any single election cycle or national context. Democratic contraction does not require a villain. It requires a population that believes the current crisis is unprecedented, that normal constraints are inadequate to the moment, and that temporary exceptions will remain temporary. Every generation that has believed these three things simultaneously has been wrong about the third. The exceptions calcify, the emergency becomes ambient. The architecture of contraction becomes invisible precisely because it was built with democratic consent, ratified by democratic majorities, and justified by democratic alarm. The proportion of Americans perceiving a serious threat to democracy dropped from 87% in August 2023 to 73% in December 2024. The threat, by every institutional metric, intensified during that period. The alarm diminished. This is not how populations respond to genuine existential danger. It is how they respond to a narrative whose utility has shifted, a signal that the feeling of crisis serves functions independent of the crisis itself, functions that benefit actors whose power depends on the perpetuation of emergency. If every generation has believed democracy was ending, and democracy has not ended, the question is not what they were afraid of. It is who benefited while they were afraid.